Good morning F11 members, and welcome to the Fundamentals of Post-Production Video Tutorials Part 1 for issue 37, January 2015. So you will have been reading in the accompanying feature in this issue the lowdown about exposure. And in particular this month we're discussing the issue of noise. So what I would like to do with you now is, in both parts of these tutorials, take you through noise, how it appears, what we can do about it in post-production. Okay, so I have here in front of me, opened up in Lightroom, the unedited raw images from a shoot in London a few weeks ago by the banks of the Thames. And what I did was unusually shoot handheld as dusk was falling and the lights were coming on, to do some pictures, not so much set piece shots of the view across the river, but more people on the banks of the Thames. And I've selected this picture here of a woman taking a selfie to now edit with you and talk through what I'm going to do with it. So let's just collect our thoughts and consider, as usual, what's going to be done before we wade in. I want to correct the verticals here. I shot with the Canon 1DX with the 24 to 70mm lens, and you can see there's this unsightly converging vertical here. This lamppost seems to be leaning in on the edge of the frame. I managed to get Big Ben pretty square, but nevertheless I can do something about that. Because it's shot handheld, if we go up here you'll see my camera settings there. ISO 12800, super high ISO, so it's quite a noisy picture. So we're going to talk through the process of noise reduction. Just out of interest, I used a focal length of a 28mm, aperture f2.8, and a shutter speed of 125th of a second. This lady was so engrossed in shooting her own selfie that she never was aware of me doing a picture of her. So let's go, and the first thing I'm going to do is look at the color balance of the image. Now I shot this as I always do, with daylight white balance set in camera. And you can see there it says 50-50 Kelvin. I'm actually this time going to use Lightroom's own auto white balance, just see how that looks, because it's quite an unsightly sort of warmish tungsten color cast on her in the foreground. So that neutralizes it a bit. It has the impact of making that blue in the shot deeper, more attractive. So I'm actually going to go with that kind of white balance, and that's fine. You can see here I've got clipping of blacks, just a few. They will be just under the arch there in the bridge. If I hover my cursor over there you can see them coming up. Not too worried about that really. And I have a few highlights clipping as well, so we'll do our best to pull some of those back, but obviously it would be unreasonable to be expecting to retain highlights here in the bright lamp there. With night shots you're always going to clip highlights and shadows. So what I'm going to do is just recover a few of those shadows. If I go too far it starts to look washed out and too just a bit flat, not really that interesting. So I'm just going to pull back shadows just a touch, about that. And I'm going to see what I can do regarding my highlights, and there actually I've recovered virtually all of them, although there still doesn't appear to be much detail there in the brightest area of the image where the lights are on. Pull them back a bit more, and come on down here. We're going to put a bit of vibrance into the shot. It's a little bit flat and uninteresting, so round about, I'd say 17 there. Okay, and I'm going to boost the brightness just a touch. touch of contrast in there with a bit of an S shape. It's looking, if I go back to where I've started, it's looking a bit more lively, a bit more interesting, isn't it? So let's just go back to loop view there, carry on down, and now we come to the sharpening. As always, I'm going to sharpen scenic and adjust the masking here but actually in this particular case I'm not going to do any masking because we're going to be dealing with noise, and I don't want to confuse the issue by applying a mask, which would also affect our noise reduction. Let's just come on here now, come on down, carry on down here, and we come down to the noise reduction tab, which is the meat and gravy of what we're doing in this video tutorial. But I'm actually going to finish with that. First, I'd just like to deal with a few issues here. So first of all, I'm going to go to level and see, no I'm not, I'm going to go to vertical. Here in the lens corrections you can see I've selected basic, and now if I click on vertical, it's straightened those converging verticals for me. That's really quite incredible, I think. Really quite a useful thing. It's not fail-safe, it doesn't always work, but in this particular case it has, and saved quite a bit of faffing around. So another feature I'm now going to use actually that we've not looked at before is this tool here, the radial filter. Now what it does, if I just click on the central point of the image, I would say around about her face, okay? That's really where the whole attention of the shot is. So I click on her and then move the cursor out, and what it's doing is applying this radial filter. It's a bit like vignetting, but we can determine to have slightly darker surround, and I'm going to do that. So where that filter is going to where this is centered is going to remain as bright as it is. I have a feather, I'm going to put it to maximum feather, which refers to the softness of the adjustments we're going to make, and I'm now just going to darken it down a touch. So it's essentially almost like a spotlight on her and the surround. Not too much. If I go too far it'll be way too obvious, but it's quite powerful sometimes to do, and I'm going to come to about there with it. Okay, then when I click on done, I'm now getting quite keen on this picture. I'm just going to brighten it again just a touch actually. So if I go up here to my tone curve, there we go, and come down now to noise reduction. Now we talked in the lowdown about how noise happens, and it's particularly a case when we have high ISOs. The trade-off is noise, and it manifests itself as, when I zoom in 100%, this grittiness. So what can we do about it? Well, we can use noise reduction, but as always there's a price to be paid. So let's just go through the process of noise reduction. Now at the moment I have no noise reduction on at all. Here we have luminance, and if I move this slider to the right, you can see it does a very effective job of removing that grittiness, that noise, what we used to think of as grain back in the film era. And if I go all the way to the right, it smooths off the picture almost totally. But as you can see, the drawback is it softens the image and reduces detail, smooths it over. So it's going to be a trade-off how far we go with this. In this particular instance, I'm going to apply round about I find often somewhere around 35% for these super high ISO 12800 settings is quite right. Now I'm going to use the detail slider here. The detail tab provides a balance between reducing luminance noise and this sort of grittiness that we've been seeing. And if I go right over to the left, you can see that there's not so much noise apparent, and if I go right over to the right, more apparent. But it's different to moving the luminance slider. In a way, I really am struggling to explain. It's one of those things that you've just got to experiment with, I would suggest. The bottom line is, as its description would suggest, is that the detail slider, when none is applied, it's actually smoothing over some of the detail there, but noise reduction is enhanced. Whereas with maximum on the detail slider, it's trying to preserve fine detail, but more noise is apparent. Again, it's a balancing act, and I think somewhere in the middle is about right. That sounds very vague, and really it is for you to ascertain, to play with. And now we have the contrast slider, which is again has a very minimal effect. So minimal that I'm struggling to see it. I do believe sometimes Adobe puts these things into their software because they can, not because we particularly need them, and I'm struggling to see any effect of the slider at all. Now, when that is the case, I would always recommend keeping it somewhere in the middle. Now, in this particular with this section of the noise reduction software, what is clearly obvious is that the luminance slider has a massive effect, one that you can see very, very clearly, whereas the detail and contrast sliders are just fine-tuning that. What I would suggest is, and what I do with an image like this, is pretty much keep detail and contrast in the slider and adjust luminance to suit. And in this particular case, around about a third takes out a fair bit of noise without smoothing over the image too much. But that's luminance noise. Now it's time to come on to color noise. Now if we're still zoomed in at 100%, so if I take the color slider out, can you see here, in all these tones, suddenly you see this color noise, horrid purpley speckles all over the place. That really is the downside of shooting at such a high ISO setting. But all is not lost, because with just a touch of color noise reduction, we can pretty much remove it. Now I've just moved that color noise reduction to just 23, and almost all of that color noise has gone. If I go way over, again, too much, and it starts to soften the image, or cause color bleed, which we do not want. But so with all of these things, with noise reduction, it's about using as little as you can get away with. That's the general rule of thumb. And I'm going to go to 25. Again, we have the same detail slider. The detail tab provides a balance between reducing color bleed and speckling. Okay, that's official from Adobe. Drag it right to reduce bleed or left to reduce speckling. So, reduce bleed to the left and to the right to reduce speckling. Now when I go as far as I can to the right, I'm starting to see more noise coming through, whereas I go as far to the left as possible, there's hardly any noise, but some of the detail is being suppressed. Again, a balancing act to know where to set it, and again in this particular case I'm going to keep it roundabout in the middle. The default setting of 50 seems to work best. Now the smoothness slider is another tool just to confuse the issue. Difficult to describe what it does. Again, I'm going to take it right out, and as I do that now I can see some color mottling start to appear here. Not so much the individual random speckles caused by color noise, but more this mottling effect, almost like a banding. So clearly I need some smoothness in there. As always though, too much will suppress detail. So again I'm at round about the middle. Unsurprisingly, all of that mottling is taken out of the image. Now there we're still looking at it at 100%, and if I go back to where we started, you can see the noise on the left and the process or the image with adjustments on the right. You can see we've reduced a fair bit of that noise. It looks a much cleaner image. I'm going to take it down to our lady. You can see there's still noise there. It's always going to be there in a picture shot at this high ISO. Nevertheless, I think we've done quite a good job of reducing it to a manageable level. So if I now go back to that and come out, and certainly viewed at normal size, it looks very, very acceptable. Noise is not something to get paranoid about. It's always something to be aware of. We'd always do our best to minimize it. We shoot with a tripod and low ISO whenever we can, but sometimes with pictures like this, shooting handheld at a high ISO enables us to make pictures that we couldn't have done otherwise. It's a wonderful liberation and a great asset, and great fun to do as well. So in part 2 I'm going to move on to looking at how noise can start to be a problem in the normal processing of our images, not just those shot at high ISO. Okay, see you in part 2.